combination of two, I'll speak as a layman and let the psychologists laugh at me, the combination of two instincts. One, humanity, in order to survive at all, had to have a great instinct for some cooperation. There's a well-known theory, for instance, that the prolongation of infancy was a cause of human progress. We had to stick together, some of us, in order to protect our infants, and therefore develop more than we would have developed if we could have got through with that job earlier. Anyway, you had cooperation, which built up families, built up clans, built up tribes, and ultimately nations and the rest, and which enabled a man, individually pretty weak, to get along somehow by cooperative activity. On the other hand, almost immediately you had conflict, and sharp conflict, somewhat individuals with individuals, but more basically groups against groups. These conflicts have gone on down from prehistory to our own time. They have had different alleged purposes, different alleged causes, but they have been conflicts. Men live very largely by their loyalties, and they live at all by the kind of loyalty that held together the family or the clan or the tribe against all sorts of adversities. But these loyalties have a way of being rather inadequate, and they get out of place, out of the proper rank of priorities. And because of our lesser loyalties, far lesser than our loyalty to humanity ought to have been, men have had very sharp conflict. Sometimes the loyalty has resulted in conflict in religious grounds, and some of the worst conflicts in history have been, allegedly at least, primarily over differing religions, different approaches to God or to the hereafter or what have you. So sometimes, and some aspects of these conflicts have been, of course, directly material. The conflict for land, conflict for gains of various sorts, for material advantage, for profit. Sometimes the conflicts have been conflicts of organizations, cities against cities, states against states, for power as well as for profit. One of the greatest principles of conflict has been in our day the religion of nationalism, the exaltation of the nation to a role which ought to be filled only by God or by humanity and not just by nation. It is the nation state that says, I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not take my name in vain, for the Senate and House committees will not hold him guiltless that taketh my name in vain. Thou shalt not kill retail. Thou shalt not refuse to kill under conscription at my command in the name of liberty, and so on and so on. You have had this element of sharp conflict. You have had also, of course, what the socialists perhaps should have mentioned first, a class conflict. There very soon became a conflict as some people had power and relative wealth, and others had nothing but their labor to provide subsistence for their families. The history of civilization is in one way, in one aspect, a history of exploitation. It was because there was some sort of an elite, usually an elite of military power, which could compel peasants to give up one way or another what they could make above what it cost them to subsist and raise their families, that you could get ancient civilizations, the civilizations of the pharaohs and all the rest of it, down indeed till our time. Now I am saying this because I don't want you to think that I'm talking about something altogether new when I talk about the conflicts of our time, or about the human nature that's behind them, or the misorganization of our structures of government which are behind them. But you do nevertheless face now aspects of these problems which I wouldn't have dreamed of when I sat in the seats of students but way back in the early part of this century. And it is important to judge these new aspects. I am so impressed with some of them that I now no longer would recommend any single book, including any that I wrote, as a kind of Bible because they have not faced the problems that have become so apparent after the Second World War quite adequately, or quite as they should have to be faced. And indeed, I will go on and say that I do not think anybody in our time, in this year of grace, is writing or saying what gives us a kind of a final answer to some of these very difficult problems we face. There are directions which are being laid down. There are precedents that are being cited. But it's your generation that's got to work through some extraordinarily difficult problems. Now, it's one of the aspects, the new aspect of old problems, has been created by amazing achievements in science and technology. Our amazing achievements in the devising of new ways and new tools to make a living and to get what men need to exist and to more than exist on this planet. Of course, in a way, this can be explained in the classroom and out as an extension of the well-known Industrial Revolution, which I presume is still talked about a great deal in the proper place. But the magnitude of the development of computers, of automated machinery, gives a new aspect to this problem and raises questions of very great significance to which there are not as yet good answers. The socialist principle that these problems and the pressure they put on resources and on people require planning, and planning obviously and dedicated to the good of all, that stands. But just how it's to be done, that you've got to face with a spirit of earnest inquiry, getting what light you can from the past, but knowing that light is not perfect. You must remember that Thomas Jefferson really believed that the hope of democracy, of American democracy, lay with the yeoman farmer. And by and large, in spite of the Industrial Revolution, in spite of the history of city-states in Greece and Italy and all, life was urban. It was primarily based first on hunting and then on agriculture. And industry was handcraft industry, and you had artisans in local centers surrounded by an agricultural population. And this was true in the United States. Even in my youth, although great corporations were springing up, it was still primarily true that the mores of America were primarily agricultural and small town, with the virtues and defects of those mores. The change has been terrific. It has been terrific, for instance, in the field of agriculture, that in the span of life of some of you even, and certainly of me, you have seen the agricultural population, the people engaged in the necessary arts of farming, fall so low as it has. Isn't it 7% about only of our population? And owing to modern science and modern machinery, it can produce far more than was produced of old, so that we have had a surplus, which is a ridiculous thing to talk about in a hungry world, but owing to our bad management of things, we have had surpluses of food which we've had trouble getting rid of on proper terms. That won't last much longer, but this has been the case. And it is a tremendous change. It took me a good while to get it into my bones, the feeling of it. But when I think now about life as it was lived in the town where I was brought up, it was an industrial town, but with a very rich farming community around it. When I remember that the happiest days of my boyhood were spent with my relatives who did live on farms, and how different that life, how utterly different it was from the corresponding life now, I know that it puts a new aspect. Because a great deal of what we do in matters of government and so on depends upon the way we are living, how we make a living, what kind of groups come natural to us. Until comparatively recently, until certainly well into this century, it was, after all, that the primary aspect of government which affected people was local and state. And sometimes that local and state government was pretty bad, and sometimes it was pretty good. But it was local and state government that mattered more to most people than now. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that that's changed. If you want any reform, you go to the federal government, because we operate now on the scale which only a federal government can deal with. We have grown from the age of relatively small business run by the people who own them, very largely, to the age of great corporations, where the actual conflict is not now so much between labor and owners, of course that's in the background, but between labor and management. It's a conflict that affects universities, especially in California. There are students in management. You have this immense size which requires rules and practices that were not necessary a generation or so ago. And it's less any ideology than this growth of change in the way we make our living and the way we live together that is responsible for some of the most insistent problems of our time. You have, therefore, the question of how to manage in a society where you have, for instance, General Motors, which in the name of free enterprise has tremendously reduced free enterprise. It is a corporation equivalent in its field to any state. It had a bigger income last year than any nation except the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and Britain. This is just one of the facts. When I was in college, to the best of my knowledge and belief and memory, there was no such thing as a placement bureau, certainly not in Princeton, of which I am a graduate. And boys were glad to get jobs with corporations and so on, but far more of us went out to get jobs. There was far more real free enterprise than now. There were fewer people who went to graduate school, partly because we weren't as intellectual as you are, and partly because there weren't wars in which it was rather necessary to persuade the government that you'd be more useful in graduate school than in Vietnam. I agree that you probably would be. Well, and anyway, that kind of thing. But the difference is enormous. Nobody in my youth would have prophesied that the United States would ever have the kind of conscription we have. It went against all the traditions of the past, but we've got it. Nobody would have thought that we would be fighting the kind of war we are in Vietnam, but we've got it. And it isn't so much because of ideas, pure and simple. It is they have something to do with it, but the reason is primarily this extraordinary development of our time. It has its consequences everywhere. Then you have seen another development which is mixed up with this development in machinery and science, but not altogether the same. I mean, this is a good development, some development of conscience, even in Los Angeles, about race relations and about our long American sin and shame of the treatment of the Negro. We are a people with many noble heritage, but with some disgraceful records in our past. The Declaration of Independence is a great document, but it began with a lie. Our ancestors, by no means all of them, held that all men were created free and equal. Not even all white men. Some were more equal than others, especially if they had more money. But at least white men had a chance. They meant by that noble sentiment that all white men were created more or less free and equal, and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of their happiness. Some of the signers kept slaves. Slavery was recognized in the slave trade, that monstrous infamy, until 1808 in the Constitution. And it was in 63 before that our slaves in this democracy were freed, and then not truly freed, and then not truly equipped for the modern world, then denied the kind of chances that we gave imperfectly to immigrants and to everybody else, but not to these people who were descended from early settlers under compulsion here in this United States. And we have the fruits of that kind of mistake to deal with, and now we have the fruits in an awakened society, the Negro themselves being awakened, and the conscience of America, thank God, stirred somewhat. Here are new aspects of old problems, problems that my generation ought to confess with shame had not properly concerned it in the years that we call sometimes the good years at the early part of this century. I could go on multiplying my illustrations. I could talk, for instance, about the necessity under these new aspects of old problems to try somewhat different methods, to attempt somewhat different efforts, make somewhat different efforts at dealing with what we now call the war against poverty. We carry on this war against poverty, at least the President of the United States, that lover of consensus, carries on the war against poverty with quite a notable rhetoric, a real Texas Baptist and evangelical fervor, and for very good cause against poverty. It's hardly matched by his performance. But what I want to point out in this connection is how little thinking he or we generally have done about some elements in the economic system. Yes, our economy, thanks to science and maybe to Keynes, even under the profits, the supremacy of the profit system, even under the thing we miscall free enterprise, even under a somewhat chastened capitalism compared with the past, our economy can and does afford fairly good largesse on a bigger scale than in the past. Not adequate. We still have our problems of the poor, depending on what your standards are, a quarter or a fifth of our people in that category. We still have them in this wildly luxurious society where you know that you're near a college when you see enormous parking lots where one of the family's cars rests during a considerable part of the day. You know, a society where Neiman Marcus in that noble state of Texas could advertise last Christmas gold-plated toilet seats for the man who has everything for $250, I think was the price, but maybe it was more. I'm quite quoting this as a kind of symbol of the sort of thing, and yet we have this poverty, we have these slums, and we have not at all an unconditional war against slums. We have it conditioned by the smallness of appropriations, by the inadequacies of the plans we accept. You could get rid of slums within, some of our commissions have reported, 20 years, with a total cost rather less than more than the total cost of continuing our Cold War in terms we do it. In the process, you would do more to deal with the problem of unemployment than in any other single way, much more than can be done by continuing the employment that the Cold War creates, because that depends more on smaller numbers of skilled workers. This is the kind of thing that I call to your attention. You aren't going to solve it without some deeper thinking, because the problem of poverty not only involves the actual food supply, the actual housing, it involves the psychological condition, the atmosphere in which people are forced to live. And if you think that there can be a truly great society which continues the appalling contrast between wild and luxurious wealth and this sort of poverty, you're terribly mistaken. It simply cannot be done, even if there is some effort made in that direction. Here are problems which I am not going to take much more time to indicate, except to say that you aren't going to get any satisfactory solutions by a glorification of the Roman principle of bread and circuses to keep the proletariat quiet. That is to say, by the welfare state. I am in favor of the welfare state, but as a road to something better and not as a blockade against further progress. I am in favor of Social Security, of Medicare, and more. I have been, through my working political life, somewhat of a pioneer in advocating a lot of these things, and I am glad they have been brought to pass somehow. But there remain questions of who ought to own what. How are we going to conserve our natural resources? How are we going to deal with population and its explosion? How are we going to keep the rapacity of men in such bounds, that we are not confronted by the so-called ethical drug industry with some of the practices the Kefauver Commission exposed. How are we to get along when we are dependent in the last analysis, like it or not, on the federal government to find out about thalidomide and its harm and its danger? These are practical questions you have to face. You have to face the question why in California, in the neighborhood of Los Angeles, in the neighborhood of New York, in the neighborhood of all great cities, it has been possible since the Second World War for the lucky owners of real estate, of land, I'm not talking about improvements to the land, to make such enormous profits. They did not create these increase of values. They are the lucky recipients of what society created, and it'd be worthwhile if there's more attention paid even now to Henry George. These are things I want to call to your attention. You are not getting solutions indefinitely by stilling the mouth of protest by bread with a little cake, and you're not going to get that bread and a little cake forever unless you go deeper and farther. You have, therefore, the kind of aspects of problems that are presented by the race situation, by the civil rights struggle, which is by no means over, certainly not in Los Angeles. You have these problems. You have the problem, again, of making real a war against poverty. And that problem is further complicated when you think in terms of the world, as you must. Perhaps one of the strangest developments since my youth, along with all the other marvelous developments, is the way that we have been tied together on a little planet, at least one of the littler planets in a lesser galaxy in a virtually infinite space. We are not the crown of creation we once thought we were, and yet we have powers that we never dreamed that we would have. For instance, how well I remember my sensations when I first went to India in so much less time than I had been used to spend when I came across the continent to California. This is a fact that of tremendous significance for you, this tying together. The movie industry has helped to create the resolution of rising expectations. People who had accepted poverty as inescapable now know that somewhere people live on that magnificent scale which Hollywood so often presents. Magnificent materially, however low otherwise. This is part of our problem. We have, moreover, a revolt in the revolution of rising expectations against the old imperialism, which did maintain a certain order and stability in the world, which was utterly smashed by 2 world wars and by the rise of the emerging nations, by the fact that the imperial powers, partly because of weakness, partly because they'd found it didn't pay, partly perhaps for higher ideals, have on the whole abandoned the old colonialism, but not therefore a new colonialism, which is struggling to make its own way in this anarchic world. We have, to be sure, some beginnings. We have a beginning in the UN, a very inadequate beginning, but a beginning to be cherished and improved, not discarded by any means. But of course, the point I'm making most of all is that in this small world, tied together as never before by radio, by television, by the movies, by ease of transportation, you have the increase of conflict and more tensions between nations than before, despite the beginnings, the valuable beginnings in the UN. And this your generation has to face, and face most seriously. And it will not be solved except as we ultimately accept the notion that the war against poverty has to be a world war in terms of humanity, affecting trade relations, affecting the control of population, the birth rate, affecting the pollution of air and water around the world, affecting the possibility of people raising enough food to live. These are tremendous problems which are now much more than foreign problems. They concern your life and your hopes for the future. You cannot have what we had or thought we had when I was young, under any circumstances, unless you face this kind of thing. And of course, I have postponed till now perhaps the greatest point that I have to make. War is an awfully old institution, perhaps older than anything except for some form of the human family. And men have fought for all kinds of reasons, good, bad, and different. And somehow they've managed to exist, and history's been written by survivors. And therefore, you can fill that rest yourself. Now we Americans brought it to pass that the thing that men have both loved and hated in such curious combination for so many millenniums of time is unusable if it's used between great powers possessed of thermonuclear weapons. The notion that you can pile up mountains of these weapons of complete destruction and never use them in the war is one of the most fantastic that can be imagined. The notion that deterrence will keep anybody from using them indefinitely is fantastic. Yes, they may have a deterrent effect, but it's a very slippery effect. Already, I have heard people speculating on the necessity for being willing, or actually to waging into thermonuclear war. We wouldn't all be killed, and maybe we could wage Herman Kahn. I think there are several stages of the wars that we could still survive. There'll be a final plunge down, but in the meanwhile, business is good for the people that make napalm bombs in California and elsewhere. This is a situation that you have to face. And you have to face it not merely in terms of theory, but in terms of events. Immediately after Hiroshima, I heard speaker after speaker, some of them in the military services, say that war was obsolete, that we had to abandon it, that it was impossible. You don't hear that anymore, not at all. And you have a situation where the quest for universal disarmament goes very slowly. How can it be otherwise when we're engaged in the war we are, the undeclared war we are in Vietnam? You have a situation where the effort to improve international controls, to substitute law for war, drags terribly. UN has been valuable, surprisingly valuable considering its limitations, but it's quite inadequate to the task. It cannot do what it ought, for instance, now in the Vietnamese War, because China and North Vietnam are excluded. You have to face this sort of situation. You have to face the fact that although we have done some good things, we and other relatively prosperous nations, our general handling of relief in terms of proper cooperation has been very weak and very inadequate. And all the situations that you can look at point in the direction of a new world war, which will have to be a thermonuclear war now that these weapons are there. We are in the position of hoping in a deterrence very much like a kindergarten teacher who has trouble with Johnny and Jimmy and says, well, now, Johnny and Jimmy, you do quarrel a lot. I'll give you each a revolver, not to use, but to deter each other. This is a good deal of what we're doing to the infantile concept that we human beings have of the way, the road to peace and the role of the religion of nationalism in the world. You've got to face that fact if you want to live. I mean that, not as a piece of rhetoric, but I mean it very literally. I do not, for instance, think that you will live to anything like my age, certainly not in common decency, if you are going to be involved, as you certainly will, in a war with China within a foreseeable future, unless our general policy is changed. You cannot possibly say to the most populous nation in the world, we don't recognize you. We will talk to you in the back, over the back fence about the alley cats, but we wouldn't recognize you. And we hope you fail, we hope you fail, we hope you fail. And then be very angry because the Chinese don't reply in terms of the Sermon on the Mount. This is a situation that you've got to face. I know the difficulties, but I think that you will have to. We will have to coexist with China, or neither of us will exist. I will maybe gathered to my fathers, whatever that is, but you won't be so fortunate. And it's from this point of view that I ask you to think about some of the recent expressions of American policy. I haven't time to examine them properly, of course. I would like to call attention to the fact that there is still a bare chance that we can redeem what we lost in Santo Domingo by completely unauthorized intervention, unnecessary, produced by the panic of a poor ambassador, poorly qualified for his post. I am very much interested in the report of a committee which I was concerned in sending recently to Santo Domingo, and they believe that there are chances that where American opinion can help to get a free election and possibly once more decent conditions. But what we did in Santo Domingo was exactly equivalent to what Russia did in Hungary. Russia said this Hungarian revolt will be taken over by Nazis and ex-Nazis and fascists. We said this constitutionalist revolt in Santo Domingo against a military junta, this will be taken over by communists. They had very little evidence, so they embarked on a type of intervention that made them set up an junta headed by a man named Imbert, who played footsie with the communists far more than any other leading Dominican. They didn't dare quite put Imbert over, and we did get a provisional government and the rest. But it's a most shocking situation. And the only excuse was a prediction contrary to fact that the communists would have taken over, by which they have greatly increased the number and influence of communists, not only in Santo Domingo, but throughout the world. I have had some context. I know what I'm talking about. Santo Domingo was one Latin American country where the Kennedy administration was thought very well of indeed. And now even the people who are not communists have a kind of bitterness of hatred. Bayard Rustin told me, for instance, that he, on this commission, waved at an American soldier who stopped and talked to him. He said, "Did you speak to me? Did you mean to?" And he said, "Why, yes, why not?" He says, "You're the first person on the street that would speak to me except to spit at me." This is the kind of affection that we have got by the kind of policies we followed. And now I turn to Vietnam, which is important not only in itself, but as a sort of a symbol of the rest. You've heard lots of speeches about Vietnam, and I suppose I will not add much to what you have heard, if anything. But I would like to hit certain of the great fallacies for which the administration is responsible. First, the fallacy that we're carrying light and liberty to a people who yearn for us to do it. I think you've noticed some signs to the contrary in recent developments in Vietnam that isn't controlled by Viet Cong. I am not saying that the majority of the Vietnamese outside Viet Cong want us to leave, not precipitately. I am assuming that probably for a long while we may be able to subsidize the government that will say, "Well, you want to go on." But I am calling attention to the fact that these predominantly Buddhist demonstrations and riots certainly contained open evidence of anti-Americanism, certainly contained open evidence that they might be getting to a page where somebody would like to negotiate instead of fight just in Vietnam itself. The most recent figures, which were published just the other day, showed that there were 104,000 desertions. I think that was the number. It was over 100,000 in 1965 from the Vietnamese army. On the other hand, I heard George Cabot Lodge, who is an advisor at the State Department on rural conditions in Vietnam and who professes not to speak for his father or any other officials. I heard him tell an audience in a rather reasonable speech that Viet Cong was becoming much more hated, really, by the people because of its indiscriminate terrorism necessary to maintain itself, and that the number of defections from Viet Cong ran at the rate of about 5,000 a month. You've got a country that needs peace desperately, that is being ruined in its soul as well as otherwise by a very cruel type of war. For what is the type of war we're waging? We're waging a war of devastation, which we can't win in a military sense any other way as against the Viet Cong and its outside help. This war of devastation will have to go on. Many correspondents have told us until North and South Vietnam, from the air and on land, are laid low and practically worthless as countries. And the poor survivors then we will have to support. We will have to have, in reality, a colony, and we will have a military base there on the borders of China. I'll come back to that. There is no winning the war in the ordinary sense in which wars have been won that is possible. And if there were, I do not think it would that this would justify the extraordinary cruelty, the indiscriminate cruelty of the war. We are acting 3 minutes. We are acting under the idea that this is not a civil war predominantly. It is. I wish I had time to give you the history, including the history of the Geneva Agreements and the breach of them by the United States. I know we didn't sign, we should have, and we should help to make them work, and we didn't. This is the kind of war it is. And to say that the President has done everything possible is ridiculous. The ambiguity of his statements, one against another, the great amount of money which convinces Vietnamese and even Americans that we're going to stay there with the military bases that we have built in such strength. These things, our refusal really to see that Viet Cong as our principal opponent must be a principal negotiator. Our refusal to make it indisputably clear that we want nothing but to get out after we have seen that there is a chance for the Vietnamese people to express themselves. This is not a real unconditional negotiation. What I want is for the government to watch for every chance for the Vietnamese themselves to begin negotiation and to encourage it in the confusions of the time. What I want is for the President himself dramatically, and he likes drama, dramatically to proclaim a ceasefire, to say, I'll stop bombing in North and South Vietnam. I will tell the troops not to fire unless fired upon. I will ask the immediate reconvening of the Geneva Nations with the Viet Cong as a principal negotiator, the National Liberation Front. Of course China will have to be there. I will assure you by every solemnity possible that our desire is to get out, not have a military base in this colony on the border of China. For I know that that's no more possible in view of peace than it would be for China to have such a colony in Mexico on our border. This is what I want the administration to say. And this is what we've got to put the pressure upon the administration to say in every reasonable way. I am hopeful that what can be done in congressional districts in the next election by the Peace Pledge campaign and by other efforts, it is a case where the people will have to speak. Because there's no doubt that Johnson carries on, partly because the polls that he has got make him believe that we, the people, in great numbers are behind this effort. That's Hubert Humphrey, that erstwhile evangelical liberal, as Hubert Humphrey would say, to carry the New Deal to Southeast Asia. Now, nevertheless, don't waste your time clapping or your energy. Remember, there are things you can do about it. And this isn't a proper peroration, but it's time to quit. Thank you.
May I have your attention, please? Before thanking Mr. Thomas, I'd like to remind you there will be a coffee hour next door in the men's lounge. This will begin in approximately 5 minutes. Also, I just received a message that the report on Santo Domingo and some of Mr. Thomas's comments will be tonight at 7 o'clock, tomorrow night on KPFK, 7 o'clock tomorrow night. This time I'd like to thank Mr. Thomas for coming here today and speaking on behalf of the speakers program. And again, I'd like to remind you that there will be a coffee hour in about 5 minutes. Thank you.